Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Choose Inclusion for our Black Voices Matter series. We are here with Dr. Vernita Glenn-White, and we're really excited to have her here today for the... Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Choose Inclusion for our Black Voices Matter. All right, I clearly have some work to do. Can you guys still hear me?
You're good.
Yes.
So I knew there was going to be a technical difficulty here. So Yubi is not with us here today. He usually runs the tech behind it, but I am here with Mike as usual. Hey, Mike.
Nina, how are you? We're going to crush it. Don't worry about it.
All right. So
we have an amazing guest, so we're good.
Yes, we're super excited about this. So Vernita is currently a professor of mathematics education at Stetson University. Her mission is to heal the nation through education. She was a K through 12 teacher, used to teach math in high school, and is really working on bridging the achievement gap in the K through 12 system. And so we're really excited to have you here. Welcome, Vernita, to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I am excited to be here with you all, and I can't wait to start our conversation.
So yeah, the first question we always ask our guests is really just, how are you doing? There's so much going on in the world right now. How are you feeling?
You know, I'm actually feeling great. And I attribute that to just a lot of centering myself, a lot of personal development work that I do with myself so I don't get, too bogged down with what's going on the outside world, things that I can't control. So I'm doing pretty good.
So can you tell us about what you're currently doing in terms of, you're a professor of mathematics education, but can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you got to where you are today?
Yes, so there are two sides of me. I am a professor at the university, then I also have my own business that I'm starting up and running. So being a professor, very quickly, I never really wanted to be a professor. A lot of people go get their PhDs in the hopes of becoming a professor, but I wanted to get my PhD because I wanted to go back to the K-12 system to tell people what to do, because they kept telling me what to do. And I noticed that all of them had doctorate degrees. And I was like, well, maybe that's what I need for people to listen to me. But no one had a doctorate degree in a content area like mathematics. So that's where I was like, okay, I guess I'll go and do that. And I was like, what's the shortest path possible to get this PhD? Now, I do not recommend people doing it that way. Like, you should do your research and study. But it took me 3 years to get my doctorate because I had to go to school full time. So I had to leave K-12, went to school full time. And then it was like, okay, I'm ready to change the world. I don't want to be a professor, but then life happens. And then I had to go back to the school system. And then that's where I really found like a passion. So it was a blessing in disguise because I saw a lot of the inequities that were happening with our school systems that were in our most affluent areas compared to our schools that were in what was categorized as low socioeconomic areas. So I wanted to move up in that area. And again, life happens. It didn't work out that way. And then I got the job at Stetson University to be a professor. And everything was going well. I was teaching a couple of courses like Foundations of Education, a few general education classes, some mathematics methods courses, and trying to navigate through the tenure and promotion process, which is a very challenging process if anyone knows about that. And then I realized, I think I was about 3 semesters in when I had a group of students say some things that just totally, rocked my world. And that'll lead to our conversation that we're going to have later on. What happened in that classroom also led me to my business, where I am focusing on really bridging the achievement gap. Well, actually eliminating the achievement gap through diversity, equity, and inclusion, where I do workshops. I do it from a different angle. I use a little bit of culturally responsiveness, but instead of attacking people, I say, look, all change that we want to happen starts with us. So I do a lot of work with personal development that stems off into diversity, equity, inclusion. So that is about me in a nutshell.
Well, doctor, I'm thrilled to have this conversation with you, and I love the technique that you're using. Um, so there are a lot of I don't know, almost shaming techniques and courses that are out there to um, engage with, and I'm a big believer on changing the pronouns from, them, well, and specifically around people with disabilities, them blind people or those deaf people, to an us conversation. How do we get, you can get people more willing to change when you start changing the pronouns to an us conversation. So I love that. Can you give some examples of how you engage your audiences and start to flip the script on that?
Okay. I It started when I had to do the work with a class that I had, and that's why I said my world changed when I had this one particular course of students who, and I tried to create a safe environment so students are free to say whatever they are feeling. I just let them know that a response is going to happen. So in this particular case, I realized that students will always say that they were colorblind. And I was like, where do you get this from? You cannot be colorblind. They're like, well, everyone is the same. And I say, no, that's not true. And then they would say things like these students over there or those types of people. And these words were coming out of their mouths. So instead of attacking them, I went through a series of, let's just talk about you yourself. Let's identify some of your invisible traits, some of your visible traits, and see how it feels if someone only talks about you based on certain traits. And we went through a process of really connecting with themselves. And then they learned, and it was a little uncomfortable because I had to be uncomfortable, and I would call them by a trait maybe they didn't like. And I told them it was a safe environment. I didn't mean any harm, but I wanted them to see how that felt. And once I got them to understand that if you calling people only by certain labels, whatever category that you're using can be hurtful. And once they felt that way, that opened the door for me to really dig deep into talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion.
So, I mean, you kind of hit on this concept of safety, and I think this is one of those conversations that our future educators aren't really talking about. Is like, what are we doing to make students safe in the classroom? But more specifically, like the language that teachers are using to talk to people of color, people of disabilities, people of different groups, of marginalized communities. What is that conversation like for when you're probably the only you're the only educator I know that's actually talking about educating, making sure that teachers are creating safe spaces in the classroom. Can you dive into that a little bit and let us know more about that?
Yes. So creating a safe space, in general, educators know how to create like the general safe space, like you're welcomed here. There is no harm. We're going to make sure that the classroom is accessible, depending on who's in our classrooms, because we do get lists and everything and accommodations and all of that. That is true. But when it comes to language safety and what can be said and shared, you actually have to go through some norms and create the norms. There are two ways to do that. Either you get norms that are already created, like I've used a few from Valencia College. There are like 13 of them that we go through, or as a group, you can come through and create your own norms about so in general, it's like what we say in here is from a place of curiosity, not from a place of harm. Be able to speak your truth. Do not leave here with unanswered questions. You will not, no repercussion will come to you if you are asking certain questions or saying certain things because you want to go to the next level, or you want to learn at a deeper knowledge. So, and I'll be honest, when I do my workshops like this with educators, it takes me about an hour to go through this because I really want to make sure, like, we can't have certain conversations if you don't feel safe enough to open your mouth and say what you're really feeling. With my future teachers, I do have a little bit more time. So it'll take me about 3 weeks to go through that process with them of what it means to really be safe. And it's a trust thing. I have to let down my guard as the facilitator, whether in a workshop or as a professor in the classroom, and be vulnerable. And so once they see what it means to be vulnerable, and I share some information with them, then it's like, okay, she's right here with us, and we trust her, that we are able to have these conversations, and she's not going to judge us. So that is a way, like creating norms would be, and not just creating them, but actually using them. So, for example, if a student says something and they know that it's not out of curiosity, then I give the students power to call that person out. So it's not coming from me. When I'm in my workshops with the teachers or administrators, I do the same thing and say we all have a collective responsibility to make sure that all of us are still feeling safe and within these conversations. Was that clear?
Yeah, like how does
Okay.
how does this play out in the classroom when like teachers aren't, well, we know that teachers aren't really doing this, right? So like
Right.
how does this play out in the classroom when they aren't doing this to Black students or for the Black community?
Well, when they are not doing that, a lot of students shut down. There's no learning that occurs, and that's where you get a lot of behavior problems. And that goes into what it really means to be culturally responsive. Sometimes people look at culturally responsiveness like another strategy in the toolkit, but it's really understanding the background and experiences of the student. So if you're not creating a safe space for a student to express themselves, or understanding their background, and you're only coming at them like one way, like you sit down, or you're not doing this right, or what's wrong with you, or you're excluding them from high level academics and things like that, then that causes the student to act out. And then again, acting out like that leads to you not doing your work, and not doing your work leads to not performing well on standardized assessments, and then all of that leads to why we have this huge gap in the achievement learning. So people don't make that correlation often. If a student doesn't feel safe mentally, physically, emotionally, they're not going to learn. And as the teacher in the classroom, or the administrator, or the educator, it is our job to take that next step of what it means to create that safe environment for students.
This feels like it needs to be a TED talk. Like I mean, I really, and I say that not, not in a way that eliminates your business, but in a way that, like, I just don't feel like this is pervasively known, pervasively done, pervasively thought of. Like, is it just me? Like, I feel like there needs to be like this, 18-minute, like, hey, educators, wake up kind of TED talk.
So I see it as two ways. Is this a new conversation? Not really, but you have to do it in action. There's a lot of research on everything that I just said, especially around culturally responsive inclusion, pedagogy, environment, and teaching. What happens sometimes is we don't take that information, what I call like beyond the ivory tower. So in higher education, or in the college fields where all these research papers and books come from the most part, we do that and we share them to our own audience, but we don't give them to the practitioner. And me being you who used to be a practitioner in the K-12 school, I never heard about any of this. Like even when I was in my teacher prep program, it was just very like surface level. So that's it. So there is research, but it doesn't get into the right hands. The other part is it's a tough conversation to have, and it's a lot of work to want to be bold enough to say, to call people out, and a lot of people aren't willing to do that. And then in order to do work like this and have conversations, you have to do some inner work. So I had to do a lot of work on myself to make sure that I wasn't triggered by some of these things that my students would say, because again, I had to make sure that I wanted to hear their truth so I can help them. So maybe the conversation is there, but you're right. Maybe I do need to do a TED talk to really bridge the two areas together.
Well,
Oh,
and
absolutely do a TED talk on this.
yes, you need to do a TED talk, because so I assume, doctor, that this wasn't just this, like, okay, I was having a glass of wine on a Friday night and I came up with this theory. Like this was a like there's a lot of data. And what to me, like leveraging a platform like TED is, again, there's so many workshops that you can do, and yet there's so many workshops that need to be done. And to me, leveraging, opening up that door of conversation, and I totally agree, like the whole this, You know, you have so many Caucasians that are coming out, white people that are coming out right now and saying, oh, Black Lives Matter, I need you to educate me. And like, no, you need to do some of the legwork yourself. And just like what you're saying, we all need to do some of that inner work. But I feel like this kind of conversation is on a TED stage is worth having from a you got to get this out there in a very pervasive way. So before people can even, as educators, like we think of like this institutionalized racism that goes on. Well, again, there's this thing that happens before we are adults with all of our perceptions, and
Yes.
this is our educational experience. Like this is the kind of stuff where you can start to turn the tides on that institutional racism.
I agree. I agree. I did put out for a TED talk, but it got pushed back because of the coronavirus until 2021. So maybe they'll pick it back up, but I'll definitely try somewhere else to get the message out, because it is a conversation that needs to be had. But when I know that some people are, what am I trying to say? They don't want to talk about it because of, I think you mentioned it before, Mike, about the shaming or people feeling judged when we have these conversations, especially with white educators. And it's like, well, I need you to be a little uncomfortable first because nothing's going to change. But I don't approach it that way of bashing or shaming.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes though, like we have to have these uncomfortable conversations for the conversation to move forward, right? To evolve and to actually come out with actionable items that will make a difference. So,
Oh, absolutely.
you know, I'm all about making people uncomfortable, right, Mike?
I'm right here, Nina. I am right here. You don't have to remind me of all the conversations.
But Rita, so I mean, this is like, let's talk about race in the classroom though. I mean, when we think about the typical classroom teacher, most of the time it's a middle class white woman. And most students, you know, Mike had his aha moment earlier before we started today, that most people have never had a Black teacher throughout K through 12 and even beyond that. I mean, what has been the impact of that reality?
So I did some research. Like the more I saw this, the more I had to think, like, where is this coming from, or how did this happen? So Dr. Beverly Tatum, she wrote a few books. One, Why Are All the Black Children Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And the second one, Can We Talk About Race? And in there, she lays out the history of what has happened with our teaching profession. And it started with um, desegregating the schools all the way back. So very quickly, I'm not going to take you on a full history lesson, but when the schools were integrated, although they were taking a lot of the Black students and putting them into the white schools, they forgot about the Black teachers and administrators. So a lot of them lost their jobs because the white schools were willing to they had to bring over the Black students, but there was nothing to protect the Black teachers and administrators. So so when that happened, a lot of students lost their role models and lost their positive role models. So as years kept going on, less and less students of color would see Black teachers or professionals in these roles. And then as higher education started opening up, because you haven't seen a Black teacher in your K-12 experience, then you don't have anything to aspire to. So that's where a decline into Black people going into the education profession. It was a huge decline that happened, because if you're not seeing yourself in a certain role, then why would you go major in that particular area? There was an increase in business administration from Black Americans, because that's what they saw as students. So when you have that on top of not going into college to get your teaching degree, then that kills the cycle or the pipeline of us having more teachers of color. So it started all the way back when we thought we wanted our schools to be integrated, but we didn't do a good job of making sure that there was a continuing pipeline of educators of color.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. That's all I can say with this. Like, to go back throughout history and thread that to kind of thread that from like, here's what we did with desegregation and integrating schools. I mean, to realize that, and I have a hard time believing, doctor, that that wasn't thought of. Like I call me, call me cynical on there, but I feel like that was almost like an intentional, when you've seen so many of the times where legislation was used in a way like this, I almost feel like this was one of those. Like I'm still a glass is half full. I've been blind my whole life, so I have to be. But I have a hard time believing that there wasn't some kind of intentional, meaning behind that. So, but that is, I thank you for the history lesson. But so let's take that and say, okay, I feel like you're a doctor of mathematics, for Pete's sake. So give me your crystal ball then. So yes, I feel like a TED Talk, people need to understand that these conversations will help with institutionalized racism policy and practice moving forward. But give me your crystal ball on like how do we turn this around in a generation?
Well, first we have to realize, like, and I'm with you, Mike. I think it was intentional. This is why it's called institutional racism. The system, people say the system is broken. The system is not broken. It was built to do exactly what it's doing. We have to change our first, acknowledge that, and that's the first step. People don't want to acknowledge that this is how it was set up. But and I'm gonna back up for a minute. Another reason, going back to what Nina said, how does this impact what's happening in our classrooms? Well, from that, you had the profession back in when they did the study, maybe about 2017ish. 3 million educators, about 65 to 70% are white female educators in the middle class area, especially in our elementary schools, where we know that is the foundation of where students get pretty much everything they need to move forward. But because of this history, and especially the deep history between Black and white Americans, it's really deep into our DNA. So in the classrooms, and I've seen this a lot, where you have a lot of white female teachers, especially our Black male students of color, or our Black male students, or any male students of color. There's a tension there, a unspoken tension that happens, and the dynamics is all the way off just from history. And people don't want to think about that, but it's generational. And again, I'm not going to go too deep into that, but the twisted relationship between white females and Black males of what has happened in history. And that does come out into the classroom. There is a very deep subconscious level of things that are happening, which impacts how they are educating those students. Do I think things can change? Absolutely. And it starts with, again, coming all the way back to pre-service education. If our field in pre-service, when I say pre-service, of course, the future teachers, we have to dismantle how we are training our teachers. We do need to recruit other teachers of color. It also needs to be a more inclusive environment. We need teachers who happen to have disabilities. We need every person represented in our education profession, because in the education profession, we don't mirror society. And that's also what is hindering us. We have to mirror society, because our students need to see representation across the board. And then we also need to take some lessons from like counseling and psychology, and really work on the person. You have to be a whole person before you can start influencing and impacting other people. And we don't do that at all. And I had to have this light bulb experience. Like, I was all content, like, you need to know your math, or you need to know your science. And none of that is relevant until we get you to a point where you truly believe that all students can learn. And the people who truly believe that all students can learn, those are the ones who are making the difference in our classrooms. Unfortunately, they're in the minority, and we have to make them become the majority. So do I think it can happen? Absolutely. But we have to be willing to let go of some of our traditions, well, a lot of our traditions in the education profession, to really start teaching, like for real teaching, about just being nice and kind and more culturally responsive.
I couldn't agree more. And this sounds very much like what's the discussions that are finally happening with our police system, right? Like the whole, again, we have to recognizing the history of the police force and what it's done. It sounds very similar to that path that's going on, does it not?
Yes, absolutely. I did a training, but I call it I said stay woke because we teach, lead, and then I added serve, who we are at our core. Because it comes out, you can only show up as your representational person for so long, and then you get triggered, and that trigger um, produces trauma. And whether your trauma is going to be internally or externally, that is what's happening both in our police force and in our classrooms.
Vernita, I know that you kind of mentioned it, but I think it's really important for our listeners to hear more context around it, because there is a dynamic between white women and Black boys and Black men in this society. And I feel like when we talk about racism and institutional racism in our country, we don't talk about that specific dynamic. And so could you give us a little bit more context and history behind that, and what that is and what that means today?
Okay. Yes.
It's important. It's really important. I really don't think
It's getting real now.
Yeah. Let's talk about it. Let's hear it.
Okay. So, and again, this is just a general history lesson where a lot of there have been a lot of situations in history where Black men were not allowed to talk, especially to white women. Now, even though white men they could do whatever they wanted to the Black women, whether they were enslaved or free, you couldn't do that as a Black male. You couldn't talk to a white woman. You couldn't even look at a white woman. However, there were white women who were intrigued by the Black male, and of course, there were some relations that happened, whatever the case may be. But then the Black males were punished. A lot of the white women, I'm not going to say all, but a lot of the white women back then realized that they could manipulate a lot of situations when it came to the Black men. And just fast forwarding, because I want to get too deep because I don't have like names of history books to tell you what to read, but it's just been a lot of from the books that I've read, white women actually did have some power with their husbands who happened to be the slave owners to say either you were going to not harm the people that were enslaved, to be brutal. Oh, basically what I'm trying to say is they had a say so in how the enslaved people were going to be treated. And if they couldn't get their way, then there was some manipulation that was happening. So I know a lot of people don't want to think that white women didn't have a voice back then. They actually did. Maybe it wasn't voting, but they did have a voice back then. So they could have spoken up a lot more than they should have. As far as education, it was now so much they felt, okay, now I need to do something. This is my chance to kind of make this wrong right. And I want to make sure that you're safe. I want to make sure that I'm educating you, but maybe I don't want to educate you at the level for you to do better than my child or my community, but just enough. And then it turned into, let's see, I'm trying to say, then it turned into not really educating at the fullest level possible. Now, this example, I'm telling you from what I've actually researched and actually experienced, where people have said these actual words to me, turned into, well, I don't want to take anything away from my whiteness, or I don't want to do my community or my white community a disservice by making sure I educate you, because if I educate you, then that means you're going to grow more into power and then you're going to take over. So it's almost, I do want to make sure that you're safe, but I want to make sure that I do just enough to still make you feel inferior. if that makes sense. So coming decades and decades and generations later, that is playing out into the classroom where we do have some great white female teachers. They want to make sure that our Black male students or our male students of color are feeling safe, but it's just enough to where they're not pushing them to the level of where they should be, because you still have to have that level of inferiority in the classroom. And I know that's kind of deep, and oh my gosh, it's like I actually said this out loud, but that's one aspect of what's happening in the classroom.
Well,
that makes perfect sense. I mean, we've seen how white women weaponize the police against Black men. Like, we've seen that over and over again. And that is why many Black men get shot by the police, is because of the weaponization of white women. Like, they can't, we're like, we give them a break or something because they didn't pull the trigger, but that doesn't mean that they're, completely innocent. And I think that's a really powerful thing to talk about, like how Black boys are learning this in the classroom, to like recognize that the people that are supposed to be supporting them aren't doing it, and they get exposed to that at a very young age.
Right. Or it's this false sense of support, really, because it's been so, like I said, it's been generations and generations, and it's a false sense of learning or teaching, I would say. It's not, because you have to have high expectations for students, and you have to challenge students. But a lot of our white female teachers, they're so afraid of being wrong or being called a racist or being perceived as prejudiced if they are pushing students to the level that they're supposed to. So a lot of our white female teachers tend to back up and say, as long as the student is, safe in the classroom physically, as long as they're behaving appropriately, then they're going to do whatever they can to get them to the next grade peacefully, instead of challenging them because of their own fears of, oh my gosh, what are people going to say if I actually challenge this student of color, especially this Black male student?
Well, and I can tell you again, I obviously I'm white, but as a student that was disabled my entire educational career, that I could feel the difference when a teacher, again, was supportive. They had a job to do, versus I had two teachers my entire educational career who took a vested interest and recognized that I was probably not giving it my all, and they were not okay with that. And they challenged me, and they happened to be math teachers, and so imagine that I went into technology and that sort of thing. But it was two teachers who said, no, Hess, that's you're slacking off. And I get it, you're not able to see it, but that doesn't mean that the educational process is done here. So I can only imagine, right? Like I don't know those shoes of a young Black or student of color. I don't know those shoes, but I know shoes that I could feel the disinterest from a teacher perspective.
Exactly. And students, and right, and like you said, you recognize that as a young student, and of course our students feel they get that. So imagine they had that every single year throughout their K-12 experience, and then people are wondering, why do we have this achievement gap? Number one, why do we have students dropping out of schools or not pursuing things? Why are certain neighborhoods a certain way? And it's like, because it goes back, and I'm not saying that everything is the education, the profession's fault. It's not all of our responsibility in the education profession. However, we play a significant role in what is happening in our society.
It is a role, and that's why I look at why I'm doing the parallel. I'm making the parallel with the police force, right? So there are roles that are being played that are significant roles, and for lack of a better word, like people aren't blind to that, right? So so I get that, and that's thank you again for so like I could talk to you, doctor, for hours on this. However,
Yeah, we're going to have to wrap up, but Vernita, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate everything you brought to us, all the knowledge, information, wisdom that hopefully our listeners will walk away and actually start challenging folks in the education system to start thinking meaningfully about the role of educators themselves in the classroom. So thank you again.
Oh, it was great being here. I realized that I was very passionate about this topic, especially during our first meeting, and it's just caused me to really go out and do more work in this area.
Well, you should be passionate about this, doctor, and that's we appreciate that passion and you just being so transparent with that passion, because this is a safe place for that. And thank you for that. And I look forward to connecting with you on digitally and that sort of thing, doctor. We really do appreciate your passion on this, and please keep us informed when you get the nod for a TEDx stage, because we will be sharing it on our social media platforms.
Well, absolutely. Yes, if it's okay, the free gift that I have, if it's okay for if people want to know more about, especially being a culturally responsive, culturally conscious leader, that's really what a focus is, because we're all leaders in a way, but in order for us to have change, we have to be culturally conscious. And I just wrote up like a quick little, these are 5 habits if people wanted to see them, from Dr. Vernita freegift.com, just so they can just get the download if they want it.
Love it. We will absolutely share it, Nina.
All right. Well, thank you, Vernita. Thank you to all the listeners as usual. You can download our podcast on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify. And as always, we broadcast our live Black Voices Matter series on YouTube. And you can check all of the links out on chooseinclusion.com. So thanks everyone again, and take care.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you,
Bye,
doctor.
everyone. You're welcome. Thank you.